Meeting Act, which is posted in the back of the room. So we'll turn this one over to Mr. Carey and Mr. Hendrickson.
Yes, thank you very much, council members. David Carey, Director of the Planning Department. Thank you for some time today. I want to just note before we get going, and this is just for the rest of your day, this bank of monitors appears to be going in and out every once in a while. So just to be aware of that. Hopefully they work fine today, but they might go in and out, just to know that. Today we want to provide you a wealth of information about the topic of transitional living, heretofore known as alternatives to imprisonment in our code. You are aware that you imposed a moratorium on this use that is in effect until November 16th. And while that still sounds a little bit farther away, it's a very fast time frame for us to get amended requirements and the appropriate conditions of future approvals of this use. So what we've been doing is really working diligently, mainly Rachel Jones and Steve Hendrickson in our office, and then getting out to a lot of different groups, including having a public meeting here in this chambers back at the end of August, and then going to the neighborhood roundtable in the near south neighborhood. And we've had a lot of discussion. We had a discussion last Wednesday with the Planning Commission as well about this. What we want to do today is make sure you have all the updated information on what the proposal includes, and I'll have Steve walk through that in detail. We also have our colleagues from the state here, which is an important part of this discussion, to give you the opportunity to ask them some questions and to find out more about how they handle these locations from the state side of things. So I do want to be clear that there's kind of a dual part of this discussion. There is the local regulatory city side, which is a zoning and land use discussion. And then there is obviously there's a programmatic side of things on the state level. We are focused on the city side, that level of this discussion with the zoning and land use, and we feel like the package of conditions of approval of this use moving forward is appropriate, but we certainly want to provide that information to you and then answer your questions as they come along today. So thank you for the time, and I'm going to hand it off to Steve.
Okay, thanks. So what we're going to do is go through the presentation that we have done for those various groups, as David mentioned. I certainly appreciate both Councilmember Raybold and Ward's patience, because they have already seen this once before. And so we're going to try to go through this very quickly. At the end, then, we will switch it over to Tyson Jenkins, Hannah Glenn, and Shane Stutzman with the state, Nebraska Office of Courts and Probation, who helped try to answer some questions from their viewpoint. We have a little less than 55 minutes to get through this, so I'll try to do my part rather quickly. But if you have any questions about the zoning proposal, feel free to stop me at any time. But we're going to try to go through the whole thing here. Shortened it a little bit for this meeting. So, as David mentioned, it's very much a land use issue. This is our zoning is our tool, but as we heard at the meeting, it's a very human issue. There's a lot of concerns from neighbors, from the residents themselves, from providers about this topic. A lot of strong feelings on both sides. So we have really been trying to work on this. We actually started looking into this topic at the beginning of the year when we had our first two proposals come forward, and have spent an awful lot of time on this since the moratorium had started, and really even back into June. Just as a quick reminder that prior to 2005, alternative to imprisonment was listed under with group homes. And it was in 2005 when we redid some of our regulations on group homes that it was split out, alternative to imprisonment facilities, as a separate special permit, but it has no conditions. So this use is allowed today by special permit, alternative to imprisonment, but then since 2005, there was a special permit for it. We just never had any applications until this year, when we've had 2 applications. So as part of our proposal, we would rename alternative to imprisonment transitional living facility, because we think it more accurately represents what the use is. In many cases, these people are not here because they'd be in prison otherwise. It's not really an alternative. They're just part of a post-corrections type of a facility. And there's various ways people might be here. Could be probation, it could be parole, it could be work release, could be a lot of different ways. While we talk a lot about probation, it is not necessarily just for probation alone. Today, it's allowed in our R residential districts, also AGR, by special permit, and by right in the downtown zoning district. But as noted, it doesn't have any special or specific conditions. So the Planning Commission, or if appealed to the City Council, can just simply vote to approve or deny it. Though with both of the applications that came forward, we worked on conditions that we thought were appropriate to the use. So if we think it's important to note that this is not the only group living type of a use. We also have children's homes, domestic shelters, residential healthcare facilities, which can include rather large group homes, fraternities, sororities, homeless shelters. So there's a lot of other group uses, group living uses, that are already allowed in the zoning ordinance. Some of them are by right, some of them are conditional use or a special permitted use. It was also important, as we're talking with the public about this, to remind people that our zoning definition of a family, there's certainly lots of definitions of families, but for the zoning ordinance, if you have 1 to 3 unrelated persons living in a household, unrelated, that can still be considered a family. So these regulations start after that point when 4 or more unrelated persons are living in the household. That's when you start getting into the group living or group homes or what we're looking at, transitional living. And so a transitional living facility would mean a facility that is affiliated with one of these kind of programs, pre-release, work release, etc., and there are more than 3 unrelated persons there. When there's 3 or less, it's just allowed by right today. It's important to note that a lot of people, it gets kind of confusing as to what's a group home and what is a transitional living facility, formerly known as alternative to imprisonment. Our group home is for 4 to 16 persons who are there for a disability or they're there in foster care. So foster care might be typically children are being cared for, the care that their parents are unable to give them, or they're there for some type of a disability. And disability is defined in the zoning ordinance, some type of physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more life's activities. So this could include people who are going through drug or alcohol rehab, that they're no longer having the current use, they are going through rehab. That would be included in the list of disabilities. So a group home, here's one of the parts where it can get confusing. A group home, when it is allowed as a conditional use in our neighborhoods, the people there have to be receiving therapy or counseling for that disability. For transitional living, they're there because specifically they're in some type of post-corrections program. You can have people living in a group home who are there to receive therapy or counseling for some disability who are also out of the correction system. So just simply being associated with post-corrections does not mean you can't be in a group home. And that's come up in a couple places where, hold it, across the street from me, they are providing services for people. Isn't that and they're all post-prison, isn't that a alternative to imprisonment today? No, in that case, they're actually being served because of their disability. Group homes today are allowed as a conditional use. There's been lots of questions of people who have said, well, hold it, if transitional living facilities today are by special permit, why shouldn't they be a special permit in the future? And we think they're very much like group homes, which are already a conditional use. The conditions are that they have to be licensed by the state and that there's a spacing requirement, 2,640 feet, a half a mile, when you're in AG, AGR, R1 to R3, or 1,200 feet in R4 to R8. Now that spacing requirement is just from one group home to another group home. It's not a group home to a fraternity or a group home to an alternative to living imprisonment. It is a group home to a group home spacing, and that'll be more important when we come up and talk about the proposal. As David mentioned, we did have a open house on August 25th. Had a really good amount of people there, both live and on Zoom. We heard a lot of concerns that were really related to operations, what's going on inside. Things like there should be a 2-year license, or there should be background checks, or that there should be 24-hour supervision. A lot of things that relate to what's going on in the inside. We also heard concerns that there wasn't any public notification. We also heard, though, from people who were providers or past people who had been served by these kind of facilities, who said that there's a very large demand for this today, and that there's a lot of people who are already living in Lincoln in private housing today, and that they're living there without any services. So it would be better for us to help encourage this type of use in our community, where they could be having some amount of supervision or some amount of services, versus just simply being housed on their own. And we heard from a couple of the providers who they definitely work hard to try to be good neighbors, particularly the Nebraska Mental Health Association of Nebraska. They're on 56th Street, next Pioneers Boulevard. They're right next door to an assisted living facility, and they talked about how they've made a lot of good connections with that facility. We won't go into a lot of it today, but we did spend quite a bit of time going to see how other cities address transitional living. We looked at Omaha, Kansas City, Lexington, Kentucky, a lot of other communities, and found that there's a whole variety of ways. Some do require special permit. Spacing requirements are quite common. Some of the spacing requirement is 500 feet to a half a mile. And so each community has kind of tailored it to their own needs, and that's what we think is best for us as well, to try to find something that works and fits best within Lincoln. So what we really look at is that this is a compromise proposal that tries to address what are the concerns of neighbors, the people who are living there, the providers who are the people who are buying the sites or entering the program, as well as for regulators like the state or planning department or building and safety, that we have a system that try to work for all of us. So whereas today there is no limit on alternatives to imprisonment as to the number of persons, this new proposal would have a 6-person limit in R1 to R4, a 12-person limit in R5 to R8. There wouldn't necessarily be a limit in our commercial zoning districts, and that we would also add a spacing requirement, so you didn't get a clustering of these uses today. Because again, today, alternative to imprisonment, there is no spacing requirement or no limit on the number of persons. And we think that if we can come forward with appropriate conditions, then it could be a conditional use, the same way that group homes are a conditional use. If you meet all of those conditions, you can go forward and proceed. And in our case, we're adding an administrative permit to check off that you meet all of those conditions, versus having a public hearing and additional conditions potentially added on. Whereas today, there's a few residential zoning districts, or all the residential zoning districts and few commercial districts, we would add several more commercial districts that would allow this use, so that there's a little bit more choice. And one thing we want to note in terms of the 12 persons that are allowed per facility in the R5 to R8. R5 to R8 is our more dense zoning district where apartments are allowed by right. In those more dense zoning districts, you could have 12 persons, but you couldn't have 12 persons in one dwelling unit. So you could have a duplex and have 6 in one dwelling unit and 6 in the other, 12 maximum, or you could have a threeplex where it's 4, 4, and 4. But you could never have more than 12 in one facility and never more than 6 in any one particular dwelling unit. And again, in commercial districts, there wouldn't be a limit. One of the important changes we think is with this compared to a difference compared to group homes is that this would have 1,000-foot spacing in the R1 to R4 and a 500-foot spacing in the R5 to R8. Now already we've got some comments that the spacing should be equal to group homes. However, group homes, as I've noted, are only spaced to other group homes. Here, we would say the spacing is not only 1,000 feet to another transitional living facility, but 1,000 feet to a domestic shelter, or a residential health care facility, or a group home, or a fraternity or sorority or a homeless shelter. So it's a spacing to a lot of different group living facilities, which will, in essence, make it harder, but it'll definitely avoid a cluster where this use is added into an area where there's already some other group living circumstances. And to just give you a rough idea, a 500-foot spacing in the R5 to R8 is about 3 blocks by 3 blocks. So all of the properties within that, even if a little part of your property is within 500 feet, that entire property would be discounted, and you couldn't have another transitional living facility within that, or there couldn't be another group home or those type of uses. And for 1,000-foot spacing, which we'd have in the R1 to R4, it'd be something akin to like 5 blocks by 5 blocks, so a pretty good size area. And on our website, we have already put together a draft map that shows in green all of the existing residential areas in the city that would meet these criteria, if these criteria are adopted by the city council as conditions. And as a substantial portion of the city then remains that somebody could locate a transitional living facility and meet these spacing requirements, because we didn't want to set up a spacing and then go and map it and find out we're not really leaving any viable options for people to locate. So again, as we noted, we think it should be a conditional use. That way, if you've addressed all of the concerns and conditions of the community, a hearing would really only result in perhaps some inconsistency, where in a hearing 10 more conditions are added on one, but no conditions are added on another. So we think this would be far more consistent if we can get the conditions set up in advance. And as I noted, we would have an administrative permit. We do have administrative permits for a few uses already today. There's some types of cell towers. There's also temporary concrete asphalt batch plants, if you're interested, that have administrative permits. So we would use that existing process where they'd submit, have to fill out an application fee. We would check off that all of the conditions have been met. We would then be able to verify the spacing. And if it was then approved, we would notify all the property owners within 200 feet. We'd also require that if the operator changed, so it went from one to another, that they have to notify the city to get the new contact information. Our text amendment also includes a revocation process, so that if you fail to meet the conditions, let's say you start having 10 people live there, or you get rid of all the parking spaces that were required, that can be revoked by the planning director. That revocation also allows for the planning director may revoke it if you start violating state, city, or other laws. So if there's some type of, in our view, a substantial violation where you are convicted of it, that might be another reason to have your administrative permit revoked. Not simply just complaints, it would have to be an actual violation of which you were convicted of. There would also be some things in there for site plans to make sure that whatever you're doing to the house, if it's an existing house, doesn't change it so substantially in a way that it couldn't be then used by somebody else as a single family or a two-family use in the future. We would also, because we don't really have specific design standards for this use, we would say if somebody's building a new house, it would have to meet our neighborhood design standards. We don't think we'll have a lot of new houses built for this, but we wanted to address that just in case. The parking requirement would be the same as it is for group homes. One space for 3 clients, and two spaces for every non-resident employee. And we'd note that we do make some allowance for if most of the residents are not going to have a driver's license. We would also then not allow signs. So I've gone through this rather quickly, but again, so the main portions of this we think that would help kind of a balanced compromise proposal would be for, at least for the neighbors, while we heard a lot of concern about what's necessarily going on the inside, we think the fact that the provider is still has some accountability to the state or the county or the feds, that is the best place for that accountability for what's going on inside to continue to reside rather than the city getting involved with that. But we would add that there would be notification of neighbors, and by having a limit of 6 residents in our R1 through R4, 12 in the higher density, that would reduce the impact on the neighborhood, and by spacing we would avoid clustering. So all those things would help in terms of the neighborhood viewpoint. For the providers themselves, they would have specific conditions. They would know what they are in advance. There would be some dependability. And it also, was important for providers that we heard some neighbors who said they wanted the limit to be 4 people. And the building codes, which we really won't talk about here today, the building codes, once you do 4 or more persons, are more stringent and often then lead to, like for instance, a fire sprinkler system, which is a substantial cost to add to a house. And so they can't afford to add that cost to just go from 3 people, which is allowed by right, to 4. So we think 6 finds that nice middle ground where it won't have substantial impact on the neighborhood, but yet provides enough people to make it worthwhile to the providers. And then so finally, also I think for the residents themselves who we had heard from, they're looking for a safe and sober place, and that is one of the main purposes of transitional living facilities. It helps them in their transition, hopefully will reduce the recidivism rate for these uses, or for these persons, because really a lot of them were just simply looking for a place where they could be welcome and accepted, and they thought it would be really great to live in this kind of a setting versus always having to necessarily look for an apartment or be in an area where they're very much off on their own. So we do have a website where we've put all of this information for the public. As mentioned, we are at the Mayor's Neighborhood Roundtable. Near South invited us out. We'd be happy to go out and talk to other groups. Because that moratorium ends on November 16th, our timeline is very tight. We have this briefing today. The Planning Commission public hearing is on September 30th. They understand their role to meet the timeline is to make a recommendation to you at that meeting. So as long as it takes, they will stay there and work on their recommendation. And then because of the holiday in October, it will be before you for City Council action on October 26th. And that way, when it is then voted on, we would have the effective date be right before the moratorium ends on November 16th. So with that, if there's any questions for me, be happy to answer those at this point. Otherwise, I'm going to turn it over to the Nebraska Office of Courts and Probation staff so they can help answer some of your questions as well, because this is that opportunity. They will not necessarily be at our public hearings.
Any questions for Steve?
Yes, I want to say thank you to Steve and David Carey for investing in your time and open house that you had, as well as being part of a discussion that we had with Senator Wishart, yes, thank you, and Senator Patty Pansing Brooks. The 2 issues that keep coming up as concerns by the neighbors, that the permittee, when they get that permit, that it can't be transferable with the sale of the property. I know you said that you addressed it as a compromise, that you have to notify building and safety of that transfer, but I think the neighbors were concerned that it just, because it is a for-profit endeavor, that there is not another check and balance, that the property is sold, they notify building and safety, and there it ends. There is no level of accountability. So I think that was one of the big things when there's a change in operator. They want to make sure that that new operator files again for a permit and goes through the whole process. And the other thing that we had made on the application, we required that the facilities be inspected every 2 years by building and safety. And then we added that caveat that if multiple violations are found during said period, the City Council may, on the motion of one of its members and following a public hearing, impose stricter controls, a probation period, or revocation of this permit at the discretion of the council. So it sounds like you're taking away the public hearing on the front end, but I think as a city council member, I want that authority to go back and review. I'm willing to grant the planning department, as we grant them the authority to approve a lot of things, but I'm willing to do that. But I also want that caveat that we have a right to raise the concerns of any complaint that we hear from the neighbor, that it is subject to a review by us at that time. And I think that's really important. to the neighbors as well, that be retained. I know that then the third question that we've been getting a lot from the residents, they feel like they've been given the runaround with the state of Nebraska on who has the authority to actually go and inspect the facilities. Where do the complaints go to the appropriate Nebraska authority so that they can understand the complaints? There was further documentation provided from the probation office, provided by Deborah Minardi, explaining that, well, the probation officers are there to make sure that those that they are in charge of are in compliance with the programming and so on. But who's in charge of making sure that that provider is giving the programming that they say they're giving? Who does those spot checks? Who does that review and verification? So I understand that you'll be able to share with us some of those safeguards so that we have a better confidence in going forward with some of these changes. But the first two that I mentioned are really, really important to the neighborhood, because it seems like we're pulling them out of a public hearing before a permit is granted, which I can understand. You have a lot of great valid reasons for doing that, but there should be some mechanism that the neighborhoods have to be able to trigger a review without having to go through the state, that it should be done on the local level as well. And that was one of the requirements that we voted on for the applicant that was before us.
Okay. Danny?
My turn?
Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me find my microphone here. Better or worse?
Better.
Thank you. Mr. Hendrick, thanks very much. And as Councilwoman Raybould said, thank all of you for your work so far. This has not been fun or easy, but you guys made it look that way. Thank you. Kind of springboarding from some of Councilwoman Raybould's questions, we did, as a council, work on a conditional approval of a group home. If we've passed this, do the other restrictions on that home go away, or would they have to reapply to be covered by these? Can you?
Good question. So there's only one special permit that's actually been approved since the other one was withdrawn. And that one would have the option, let's say this administrative permit process is approved and there's 10 conditions, let's say, that they would have the ability to come in, and if they asked for the administrative permit and met those 10 conditions, they could then ask for their previous special permit to be rescinded and live by just the conditions of the administrative permit. That way they would be living by the same conditions as everybody else who is a transitional living facility.
And the other quick question is, as Councilwoman Raybould said, public hearing. The public would like to weigh in. The administrative permit would take care of all the, you check all the conditions, there's no need for a public hearing, you've done everything the community has asked, theoretically. Is there a mechanism for us, the council, to pull that out of your office to a public hearing? Has that happened before, where we
No, as proposed as a conditional use, there isn't a process for pulling that out. We have a lot of other conditional commercial uses, some in commercial districts, other residential uses, and if you meet the conditions, you're permitted. If you don't, you don't. And none of the rest of those have a process necessarily to appeal that up to the city council or the planning commission level. Some of them have an alternative special permit, but most of the cases when it's a conditional use, like a group home, today if a group home does not meet the spacing requirement, they can't go in. And likewise, if there is some concern with a group home today, we have some processes to deal with that. If it's a housing issues, the place is terrible and there's housing code violations, well, you can turn them over to building and safety, who would address that issue. If there's some concern in regards to violations where you need to call the police, you still have the ability to do that. So with this one, we were trying to make it clear that it could be revoked by the planning director for failure to meet those conditions. But like other conditional uses, it doesn't have a process for appeal.
Just one more hypothetical. So the group homes are governed by spacing. That's a very broad, simplified. But if I want to put a group home in and I can't meet the spacing requirements, do I, as a facilitator, get the option to appeal to someone?
No, again, so people call us and they say, I'm looking at this house, I'm thinking of doing a group home. we find out you don't meet the spacing and tell them they don't meet the spacing and you can't go there. So they have to pass on that house and go on to the next one. And hopefully in most of the cases, they haven't already signed a lease for the property, they call us first, or contact building safety first.
Thank you for indulging me. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
I just got a really quick question because I want to leave time for our friends with
Yes.
the state to talk. The only question that I have is when you showed the examples, I think it was Kentucky and Kansas, as we had gotten suggestions in from people of other cities, they had provided requirements of halfway houses, not what this service is, this transitional living service. So I guess my quick question is, for the examples and the research that you looked through, was that through like halfway houses, or was it for this exact same program or service? I'm sorry.
You have an excellent question, and that was very difficult because some communities may call them slightly different things, or they may even call them transitional living facilities, but then when you look at a definition, it's different. So it was definitely not an apples to apples comparison. We were providing you a variety of fruits because each community has something slightly different. And people have written us letters saying, well, look at this community. And we look in depth, we find out, no, that's more like a corrections facility where people are actually physically being locked up. That's not at all what we're looking at. So I can't, we can look at them a little more carefully, but if you have one in specific, but that's a good point that it's not always apples to apples.
Thank you so much.
Councilman Christensen.
I guess I have some questions, but since we have you all the ways,
That's right.
and we have guests here seldom, I would like to use the rest of our time here to listen to what the people from the state have to say.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yay.
Thanks, Steve.
Professional development, come on down.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having us and inviting us to be here. I am Shane Stutzman. I am the Assistant Deputy Administrator for the Administrative Office of the Courts and Probation. My division oversees transitional living. These are the experts behind me, so I just wanted to give you a quick history, kind of how we got here. I believe it was in 2015 when the legislature passed LB 605 and 1094. And what that did was we are under the judicial branch of government. Parole is under the executive branch of government. Historically, parole oversaw all individuals coming out of the prison system. LB 605 gave us those lower level felony offenses and left the higher, more serious felonies with parole. So we got into the business of supervising people coming out of the institutions. What we discovered was there was a need for this safe and sober housing. And so kind of how we work, we put out a service definition and said, hey, we have these folks coming out of the prison system that don't have a home. They've lost their apartment, they've lost their home, they've lost their job. And we saw that they were not appropriate always for the mission system, or we couldn't control where they were living that was stable. So we put out a service definition, which is how we operate in our organization, and we try and partner with local providers across the entire state. So this wasn't just a Lincoln issue. These people were coming out. 95% of the people in the prison system are coming back to their home communities, and that was across the state. So we put out a service definition. Hannah and Tyson are going to answer your questions around that. I'm sure you have some. But across the state, and said we have a need for safe and sober housing. Let's see. Our role in this is that we oversee case management. So we have 14 probation districts across the state that provide case management to every individual under the court's jurisdiction that is on community supervision under probation. We have district chief probation officers. You have one here in Lincoln, Jeff Curry. His office is right over there if you want to talk to him about this. But they oversee the conditions of the court and policies and protocols we have around case management. Many of those require us to be in the field doing home visits. We're in these houses routinely. We also have 17 reporting centers across the state where individuals come for a sort of a one-stop shop, if you may, for drug testing, for programming, for other types of educational or employment services. And so we provide the structure around community supervision as part of our case management. I think one of the things I hope that we've all learned and that you will take away with this is that if we don't address these service needs that these individuals have, it is a greater community risk and a community safety issue. So that was our intention, was that we can provide structure, we have more accountability where these individuals are residing. This is also short-term housing. We provide financial assistance to them. But the intent is to get them into independence, back into their family setting or to independent living as soon as possible. I just made some notes, so I made sure I covered the high points, and we are happy to answer any additional questions you have. But keeping in mind, we are just one entity in the justice continuum that uses these facilities that have been around a long time. Questions?
Any questions for Ms. Stutzman? Yes, Jane.
Well, it goes back to some of the original concerns. How are you assured that the transitional living with in-house programming is actually being provided to the residents?
Hannah, do you want to come talk about service definitions? Good question.
Yes, hi, I'm Hannah Glenn. I'm one of the specialists that oversees this program. That's kind of addressed on multiple levels. So we have service definitions, and those have to be, there's part of an application process. So before anybody can even get to that point, and a provider would have to apply and basically submit a program plan detailing how they're going to meet those service definition expectations. And then once they kind of are going through that, once they're approved initially on that application process, then they are become part of our registered service provider system. So this is the process for any and all providers who want to provide services for probation. So that would be the same as if somebody was providing evaluations or for the juvenile world, like group home, group facility living. It all follows the same process. So on the back end, once people are actually officially approved and in the registered service provider system, they have to agree to do basically play by the court's rules in that sense. And then there is kind of a quality assurance piece built into that on the back end. So once they are approved to provide the service, then as Shane mentioned, our officers are in there checking. They are aware of the service expectations. So they're doing on a regular home visit. Typically, they're going to be asking about what programming have you been doing this week. They're going to be aware of the scheduling things that should match what we have on the application and in the service definition, in the program plans. And then again, we've kind of are building in this spot check system for quality assurance where, obviously if there's any complaints or things like that, we have a full investigations process where we begin to look into that. So if we got reports that there wasn't that level of programming happening in the house, we would look into it right away. But then we have the quality assurance, which is kind of just more of a systemic check. So sometimes that is like a targeted pull for housing. Sometimes that is more of a random, we have to do X amount per year. I know Teresa's working on updating a protocol around that to kind of provide some additional parameters, but there is a quality assurance process built in for not just transitional living, but for all probation services as well.
So for the transitional living, the in-house programming, the provider says, hey, I gave this resident 5 hours of programming a week. What paperwork do they have to fill out, and who verifies that the 5 hours of programming were indeed completed that week?
Well, I guess the short answer is that there's not any sort of paperwork. Again, that kind of goes along with any other probation services, that we don't necessarily have that level of follow-up required. That's something that's going to be built into our officers' case management. So the officers are looking at that, but it's not something where they would necessarily have to, complete this paperwork and put it in a file and check off that this person did it 5 hours every single week for the weeks that they were there. I will say that as part of the registered service provider system, that in order to receive reimbursement, they have to complete a voucher is the language that we use. And as part of that, there is a report that's required every month. So they have to attest to what they've been working on. And you're going to be able to capture a lot of that program detail in that as well. So, and you may have more to say about that.
So the resident doesn't have to sign off on like, yes, I did get 5 hours of programming that week, because I know the reimbursable to the provider is dramatically different. There's a different reimbursable rate where you go from, is it $26 a day, but if you offer 5 hours of programming per week, it jumps up to $90-something. So I just wanted to know, what are the checks and balances to make sure that that provider did indeed give that level of programming as they stipulated they would, and that it was actually delivered. And it doesn't sound, I mean, and can a resident who's there, who does the resident complain to? The probation officer? Do they complain to the quality compliance reviewers if they know who they are? Or how does a resident, you know, when we talk to a lot of the neighbors, they are all for making sure that we offer this type of transitional housing. But they had, the two main complaints. How are we actually taking care of the residents in the house to make sure that they're getting the programming that is stipulated by some of these for-profit entities?
I feel like that's our job.
Yeah.
Right,
That
but
is our job, to make sure that the residents are getting their needs met. As far as complaints go, you could complain to a number of places. So you could complain to the homeowner, or the provider would be my first, it would depend on the issue. We also had the chief probation officer, who apparently walked by right when I said his name, or the probation officer, and eventually it would work its way up to our office if it wasn't resolved to the complainant's satisfaction.
so if a resident complained that, hey, I only got like 3 hours of programming this week and 3 hours next week, they can complain to the probation officers, and then it's up to the probation officer. Well, it was close to 5, so I'm not going to really. I mean, our concern is that it's all taxpayers' money paying the higher rate of reimbursement.
We are also very concerned with that as well, and pride ourselves on trying to be good stewards of the tax dollar. That may happen in a given week where you might have had an illness, you might have been incarcerated on a custodial sanction for not doing some of your programming the week before. So there's lots of reasons why a person might not be able to complete all 5 hours, but that is our expectation, and that is an agreed upon expectation with the provider that officers are constantly in communication with about. Most of it's around employment services or employment skill building or life skills. And so we've never had clients complain that they're not getting enough programming, because we saturate them. And that's our expectation at the house as well. So do we check attendance for every person at every facility? No, but there are spot checks whether that does occur.
I'll also say, usually as part of the application, when they're submitting their programming detail, I'll say, send me your schedule. What days are you, show me on paper at least how you're going to get to 5 hours of programming per week. And then again, the officers are supposed to know about that and build that into the case management. But as part of that QA process, if and when we would go in and say, show me your documentation for this, they would have to be able to produce that. And if they couldn't, then there would be obviously like a program improvement plan or consequences for that. And as far up as being removed from that type of a provider, and they would not be allowed to provide that service anymore. So again, even though that's not necessarily happening at every provider at every single week, those pieces of it are built into it, and it is being checked in on regularly.
So does the probation officer, I'm sorry, I have a whole bunch of questions. Does the
And we
probation
got some
officer?
others, Jane, that want to ask questions.
Right, sure.
too.
I'm loaded with questions all the time. Does the probation officer say, hey, I want to see your new digs, give me a tour of your new facility? And does the probation officer see things that look awful? I mean, does the probation officer report, or do they do that? And then, or do you even do pre-approval inspections of that residence before they are granted
Yes.
the TLRSP?
Yes, so typically, as part of the applications process, if it's not me, we haven't had anybody come on board in this new COVID situation, so I don't know what exactly that looks like. But historically, it's me that actually goes to the facility and does a walkthrough. I don't necessarily check for, I do not check for like that it matches building codes or things like that, because that's not my area of expertise. But I will walk through it from a probation's standpoint, or with that set of eyes to say, is this a safe place for somebody to live? Does this look like it's going to provide somebody the stability and support to be successful on probation? The same way we would check somebody's, if they're releasing from prison, typically we'll do a home visit before placing them back at like their parents' house to make sure that there's no weapons on site or, that there's not active drug use or things happening like that. So we're walking through the house prior to anybody's placement at that level. And then that's what the officers are also looking for when they're doing their home visits. And that's part of their regular case management. So they're walking through to say, does that have, is there a hole in the floor? Does this look like a safe place for somebody to continue living? And if there's not, then they or the process is that they try to address it directly with the provider. Their district level management is involved if issues are not resolved, and then it comes up to administration. And again, we can go from anywhere from like a program improvement plan to a removal from providing that service altogether.
And so if a neighborhood association has complaints, how do they get the complaints to you then?
They can call us.
Yeah.
I mean, they can call, it's on our website. You can call the State Probation Administration. I guarantee you they will find me and be responding.
Okay.
Because I see the number 402-471-3730.
Yep, that sounds pretty close.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay,
Councilperson Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we've heard about your systemic checks, your spot checks, and routine home visits, but I'm not sure that I understand how often you really do home visits. And what prompted this whole initiative was our situation on South 28th Street that we've not just been able to get answers to about when you do home visits. And just to reiterate, the residents are our primary concern, as they are with this particular neighborhood. So when you say you do routine home visits, can you please tell us what that means?
So our
often is that?
Our field visit policy and protocol is dictated on somebody's actuarial risk.
Could you take your mask off so we can hear you?
So somebody who is, we do our engagement based off an actuarial risk, like how risky, how much intervention do you need? The higher the level it is, so we have a risk scoring instrument that's Likert scale numerical. The higher you are, at a minimum, you would have 2 every 30 days, where we're in the field. Lower on that side would be 1 for 30 days. Anybody that'd be lower in those requirements are not going to be in your houses because they're not going to be required for, they won't need that type of service. That's why they're that low of risk. So at a minimum, if somebody's of a high risk nature, they will be in there at least twice a week. 2 of those field visits, twice a month, sorry.
So they will be in there, your probation officers will be in the home twice a month at a minimum.
Per client.
Okay.
So if I have 3 clients in there, then I would have to be in there
6 times.
6 times a week.
Okay.
Now, each district may do things a little different. So I can speak for the city of Lincoln anyways. The district management team in Lincoln has assigned a particular staff member to go there once a week just to talk to the provider outside of case management. So they're doubling down on that standard for what that looks like. As Shane kind of alluded to, just because somebody's in the house does not necessarily mean they're on probation. So parole may be in that house as well, Lancaster County Corrections, anything and everybody in between. When I say twice a month, that really doesn't seem like that, but our typical engagement for somebody being in this house is around 60 days. So they're only there for 2 months. So a lot of the things the zoning talked about is not for these long-term individuals that are going to be residing there. It's a kind of a cycle in. You needed a transitional support as you maybe left incarceration to get some things underneath you so then you can move on to what that next level is. Typically, a lot of our guys that come out, it's mostly men, but there's a lot of women too, come out of the work release. So they've been working in some capacity. They have 75% of the funds saved that they needed to get to where they need to be. And for a month, for 6 weeks, whatever it ends up being, until they can gather a third paycheck, until they can move on to where that next level is for what that looks like. So our individuals that, at least under our purview, are usually short-term in that capacity. And in that short term, the probation officer, depending on risk level, is in there at least twice a month, but they're in our offices 3 times a week on top of that. So that's what the engagement looks like. Lancaster County, if you are on probation in Lancaster County, you're getting drug tested 3 times a week, which means you're over there on the other side of that parking lot getting drug tested at 5:30 in the morning 3 times a week. The probation officer on a month, let's just say every other week, is in your facility, and then I'm attending 2 reporting center groups about cognitive behavioral restructuring or employment or something like that 2 other days a week. So that's the type of engagement. Plus, I'm in substance abuse treatment, whatever else is along with, for that particular case.
I just
Right,
wanted
that's
to mention also that we are able and willing to speak to any neighborhood associations that might want to, and we've spoken to several. So you are welcome. I have my card, and I'll leave it with you if that's okay, Jane. And then we are happy to continue this conversation with them if they would prefer. But go ahead.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I think part of this is an education process for everyone that what is the city responsible for, what is the state responsible for. My last question is back to contacting people. So 24/7, so we know we can contact you during the week. But what about, and we have had conversations and many questions from inside and outside these residences and people who live in the area, without calling Lincoln Police, without this particular owner has offered her contact information, but who within your system, if it is within your system, 24/7, about an incident on the weekend or in the middle of the night where there's a concern, and maybe it's for the residents, the participants' protection or safety, then what do we do?
Well, the simple answer would be the local management team is the conduit for that. For what that looks like. The probation
But
officer.
how do we know who that is?
Well, that's a
We
good
know-
point too.
I
We
mean-
don't know that the person you're complaining
But
about.
if you
is
don't
even
know,
under
how would the
probation.
neighbors know? I mean, do you understand what I'm saying? There's there's holes in this system that we're trying to help people understand. And if you don't know and we don't know, how can we expect people in that home or people that live next to the home to know?
Well, my first thing would be, do they know the homeowner?
Yes.
The provider. The
Yes.
provider should be able to give them the probation officer's cell phone. We are on call 24/7, myself included. And so. all
More
you have to
phones.
do- Yes. All you
So
have
that
to
would be
do-
appropriate for that provider to give out a probation officer's cell number
Absolutely.
to the neighborhood.
Yeah, I often wonder when I hear these, who are you talking to that is not? Because if you said the word transitional living, I guarantee you, these three right here would be contacted immediately. But
24/7.
24/7.
Good,
I love
good.
this thing. I live with it. Yeah.
What?
But I mean, I am dead serious, and that is the expectation. Probation officers do not work
Good.
8 to 5. They work non-traditional hours and weekends and are expected to be responsive to any type of community concern.
Well, and I think as you were saying too, it may be somebody on parole, and so having that homeowner's contact information is probably the first step.
We've gotten there, we've gotten
Yeah.
that far.
Yeah.
But that's as far as we've gotten.
I would say that accountability structure and ability to contact is probably more so than if your next door neighbor at some point or the person across the street has been on probation and you didn't know it. So who were you contacting in that particular scenario? You would call the Lincoln Police Department, or depending on the severity of what was going on with that. I mean, that's really the crux of what this comes down to, is these people are in this community regardless. And
Exactly.
the question is,
Yeah.
are they in some sort of structured thing that we can have some accountability and oversight for, or are they just wandering?
Thank you very much.
Councilperson Washington.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have two questions. I'll try and make it quick. So you've said probation and parole, and you've distinguished between the two, but can you explain a little bit about what would be the requirements of contact if it was parole, not
could not speak
probation?
to that.
You cannot speak to
No, you
that,
have
but
to
the
speak.
houses might have clients that are both on parole and on
They
probation.
might have people in there that are under no community supervision. I mean, that's an important structure too. We're not dictating who can and cannot live in that house outside of what would be in conflict with the person's core conditions. And this is not just a Lincoln thing, so like I'm in Kearney the other day meeting with the housing provider there, and they have people that live in that place still that were never under community corrections. They just needed some sort of sober living environment they could afford, or they were, and they stayed there because they were demonstrating success. So within that, they could be anywhere.
So does the state reimburse for those people who weren't told they needed to be there?
We
No.
don't.
You don't?
No.
Okay. Does some other department in the state?
I couldn't speak to that.
All right.
Parole does for their own.
Okay, so parole does.
But if it's a private person that is homeless, that they would pay their own somehow, some way, or if they had a sponsor. But the
Okay.
state does not.
All right. All right, that was one question. The second question, so I'm not trying to gum you up or have you trip over your feet, but you said that there was a monthly report on programming, but earlier you said there was no requirement to take down who attended what program. So if you could
There's a difference.
clarify.
One would be kind of like what you I would consider being an attendance report, and the other one would be more of an outcome-based report. They have demonstrated better, more success in, things like hygiene, toward they now have employment. It doesn't necessarily, they attended these groups and now they have that. So it's more of an outcome. I solved the math problem without showing my work type of scenario.
So they're paid based on the outcomes, not,
No, they're not
Okay.
paid based on outcomes. They're paid
so when
based
they
providing
give
service.
a weekly or a monthly report saying, these are the services we provided, tell me a little bit in more detail what you mean by that. Do they have to say what day services, or do they just say, we offered 15 units of this kind of program?
They're paid for that, they met the service definition in that delivery, and by submitting that voucher system, they're attesting to that fact. The actual attendance and all the group things is handled at a case management level with that probation officer. If the probation officer went in, and it's their job, they're accountable to this, and they go in and they meet with that client and they say, okay, I know that you're supposed to be attending 5 nights of employment practice interviewing. And they say, no, I didn't do anything this week. One of the things they're doing is going straight to that provider and tell me why this person didn't do it. If they don't get correct resolution in that, then they're calling our offices where that goes in.
Okay.
Since I hold the probation officer responsible in their case management to ask those questions and integrate it, they're not doing their job if they don't do that. And then they're hearing from me on that end, as well as the provider hearing from Hannah or myself for what that looks like.
That clarifies it a bit. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. James Michael, you want Danny? You got a quick question?
Yeah, really quick. Thank you,
Okay.
Mr. Chair. And the microphone again. We talked a lot about contact and the house manager, for lack of a better word. Is there a requirement that they tell me? If I'm a probation person on probation and the neighbor says, who's your probation officer? Am I required to tell them that?
If
Or
just a random street person were to ask you. your
neighbor
question.
says, hey, I'm going to call your probation officer. What's their name? Am I required to by your regulations, or is the homeowner required to share that information?
The probation officer would not be required to share that with anybody that wasn't a extension of the court or a law enforcement entity. Our provider, as we expect them to be good stewards of their community and their neighborhood, and to purposefully withhold that information would be kind of a disenfranchisement of that process.
My initials.
So we would have a question,
Yes.
we would have a question with them in regards to why they would hold that or what that looks like, and we would guide them. There's a difference between what we allow and what we support. Service definitions are very black and white, and how we get along with people and the best way practice of doing businesses is an ongoing coaching session that's different in the city of Lincoln than it is when we deal with people in Scottsbluff, North Platte, Omaha, Sioux City, because we see the state of Nebraska, and the needs are different within those things, and the municipality codes in which you guys make and enforce are different for what that looks like. So we can't be the stewards of your municipality codes. It's not within our purview. That's a separation of powers and everything that goes with that. We provide financial short-term assistance for people for a specific program. Our providers, when they apply for that, attest that they are going to meet whatever codes or restrictions you as a municipality place on them. We do not enforce those. If you came to us and said these people aren't doing it, then they'd be in violation of that contract. But if you put some sort of stipulation on there, any of these things on here, we're going to say that you're accountable to that, but we're not going to enforce it. We can't enforce it. We're not that mechanism. We're not a licensing entity. We're not a building entity. We're not a zoning entity.
And I think it's
But if we bring it
important-
to your
we take-
attention, you would do something.
Yes.
We take calls from the public all the time, ex-husbands, ex-girlfriends, an employer that's mad at we take, we're not that hard to find, we're really not. If you call the Lincoln Police Department, we work with the Lincoln Police Department all the time, they know the number, they'll get you to the probation office, we're on the internet, so, if a provider did not provide a probation office, at least the district number, I would be very concerned.
Okay, thank you so much. One last question. Yes, Councilman.
So I know everyone's kind of anxious because we have a 2:00 meeting that was supposed to start, and we're already 3 minutes past that. But I think that this is really good, and
This is more important.
I do not want this conversation to be rushed to go through things that are a committee report that could be dealt with next week. So I appreciate everyone's patience as I kind of ask these next questions. We have received a lot of recommendations and suggestions on what these transitional living facilities should look like. As I did some digging and I looked through the recommendations that people were sending in, come to find out that these were recommendations for halfway houses. So my question is, are these transitional living shelters the same as a halfway house, or are they different?
No, the halfway houses, and there's only 5 in the entire state of Nebraska, give a residential treatment facility. I'm receiving on-site therapy for mental health or substance use or both, along with a residential living environment. They are actually licensed by the Department of Health and Human Services, which is a branch of the executive branch, and have all the licensing requirements that go along with that, to include things like building code inspections and everything, from the actual brick and mortar to the license of the person to do it, the therapeutic agent, everything that goes along with that, standards and practices that are national and state enforced by the Department of Health and Human Services. That's how we define halfway houses in the state of Nebraska. And I think that's some of the confusion, particularly every time I read something in the Journal Star that says the city council says this on halfway houses. Well, those aren't halfway houses by our definition of how they're paid, licensed, and overseen by the state of Nebraska. These are, and then the, what was it, alternatives to imprisonment? I mean, that wasn't our term. And it made it sound like you go here or you go to prison, when, that you spoke about before, most of these people have done some sort of incarceration already. And this was that, not just open the door, good luck, we'll see you later type of thing, at least for the short term, is, that very first initial 3 weeks, 60 days, 90 days, and how important that is for not going back.
There's a lot of treatment programming that go along with the halfway house. Many of you are familiar with St. Monica's or Houses of Hope or those entities. Those are halfway houses.
Perfect, thank you. My next question is, and I would appreciate everyone's.
Go ahead.
Okay. There's been a lot of people who've been very upset that the rate is, that I know that there's a tiered system, but the one that really pops up is this $90 a day for the 5 hours of programming a week. Can you share a little bit about how we came to that fee structure?
Yeah, so, sorry. The halfway houses are, as Tyson said, licensed by DHHS. As such, they have a reimbursement rate through the regions, the behavioral health regions, and I believe that rate is at $134 a day. Part of that licensing requirement is that they provide 8 hours of programming a week, and so we kind of started there and deduced. So if we're only requiring 5 hours a week, obviously we're not going to pay the $134 rate. So $90 was kind of where we started at. And also, I believe, this was prior to my time, but I believe they kind of cross-referenced that with what other states had maybe been doing to see similar programming requirements. The one thing I just kind of wanted to mention too is that this is a relatively new program. One thing that we are continued to be committed to at probation is internal evaluation of the programming. So this is something we're constantly looking at and evaluating to see where we potentially may need to make changes. So one of the things with the $90 a day rate is looking at, do we need to add additional requirements? Do we need to add an additional level of service to maybe kind of bridge the gap between the halfway house and then the lowest tier of without programming? So, those are conversations that we have internally pretty regularly as well. So
thank you. And then my last question, and you touched on this during my first question. Recently, there was a letter to the editor in the Journal Star that stated that if these individuals were not in one of these living facilities, then they would be back they would be incarcerated again. Is that an accurate statement?
I'd say they're more prevalent too. We always talk prevalence, trends, statistics, whatever the case. There might be an individual. There's literature upon literature upon literature that somebody's success is a combination of self-motivation, circumstance, and Maslow's hierarchy needs at a minimum. Do I even have the basic necessities of human life to be expected to be successful? If I am living park bench to park bench or in the shelter and I need to be at the probation office here and apply for a job over here, is that a reasonable expectation when I don't even have the same bed every single night? Or do I expect to have behavior change for years I've been couch hopping with my other felony friends that are not giving me good pro-social supports? Can I take that away, give you a short-term intervention with some skills, so when we take that back, because it's not long-term, it's very short-term in what that looks like, can I at least get you to a place that you can be successful because I gave you some strategies? That if you do have to go to a place like the Mission because there are no other options, am I safer than what I was when I came straight out? And that's really what we're looking at intervening there and being able to give them the best chance to be successful.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. The one other thing too on the $90 a day I'd like to talk about is a lot of the houses go above and beyond what we ask. Many of the houses have their own drug testing programs in which they do not, if you test positive, it's not part of your court thing because we're testing all as well, but they'll take you straight to detox where you have to leave the house. Or they have their own curfew engagements. So they have whatever their own house rules are that are far and beyond what we ask them to do in that service definition.
Because we have an RTSD meeting at 2.
Oh, that's right, we got an RTSD.
So we
Can
gotta
we
go.
hold off on that, Jane? We need
Well,
to move
it's a
on.
real quick question. Are the residents in the houses aware of their rights? The provider gets an orientation, guidance, but are the residents that are in the house, do they understand their rights, that they have the right to complain if they're not getting these services? Okay.
Yeah, we spend a lot of time onboarding new clients, you bet.
Well, thank you, Tyson, Hannah, Shane, good to see you. We may have other questions for you moving forward, and we'll contact you individually if we do.
And your planning department, terrific people. They've been great to work with. so-
Agreed.
Oh, chief.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Okay.
Legal too.
Should we move directly into our directors' meeting?
Sure.
Call the order, the directors' organizational meeting of Monday, September 21st, 2020. Back of the room is our Open Meeting Act, if anybody has an interest in that. So let's go forward and talk about the agenda here. Sony, here she
Here
comes.
she comes, walking down the streets.
In the meantime, maybe we could have, is Pat Lopez here? No, she's out.
She's out.
We have anybody from the health department here? Okay,
Bye, thank you.
pardon me?
My question was like, if they, we'll talk to you after.
Okay. Sony, are you prepared yet to tell us your changes?
Oops. Where'd it go?
Yes,
Okay. Yeah, I know. We got the email. This is great.
sure. Okay, so for today's agenda, there isn't much of a change. I will be calling items under section 4, items 4A, 4B, and 4C together, items 4D and 4E together, and on public hearing ordinances, second reading, and related resolutions, items 6A through 6D together. And that's most of the changes. The only other two notes I had were just clerical notes for ordinances, second reading, and related resolutions. Item 6A, we added the letter A to the end of the bill number assigned.
Which one?
Say that again, Sony?
For item 6A, bill number 20-222.
Oh, okay.
Yep, we just added the letter A to the end of that bill number. We had already assigned that number to a different item on the agenda, so the easiest fix was to add that clerical A. And that's all I have.
Okay. Thank you. Boards and committees. Safe and Successful Kids, Mr. Show.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We met here in this chamber at 12:30 on the date outlined on our agenda. We got a report on the progress of the mental health counseling program and some other issues. We approved the budget for the next fiscal year, and we elected new officers with Kathy Danick serving as our new president for the next incoming year.
You're our new vice president.
I will serve as vice president, vice chair, whatever we call it. I'm number 2.
Our
Mr.
next meeting will be October.
Yes, October, I think was the next meeting.
Okay. Any other questions? How about for the MEC committee?
I want to do one more thing for Safe and Successful Kids.
Okay.
We did talk about RSOs, and there were a few people from the community that came and expressed their concerns about the issue. Just a few, I think about 5 community members came and spoke in the public hearing about that.
About which issue?
SROs?
Thank you.
I'm sorry. I'm not limiting the mic, and I'm speaking through a piece of, yeah.
Yeah.
School resource officers. MAC committee meeting was a Zoom-based meeting, and I had some connectivity issues, but we did get a presentation from the census to talk about their current status and where we're going in the future and not.
Okay. And then for the Downtown Lincoln Association. Either was I. We have no report. We have one next week. Okay. And I'll report on that one. Any other questions, comments? Does anybody want to speak with any of the directors?
I'd like to speak with someone from finance.
Okay. Anybody else?
Mr. Johnson from Parks and Recs,
Okay.
please.
And I would like to speak with someone from LTU.
Jane?
David Carey.
Pardon me?
I'd like to speak to David Carey.
Okay.
And are we going to skip the mayor's office this week?
I don't know. Oh, you're going to do that, John?
Okay.
Yay, John.
Well, I don't know.
We want you to talk to us.
You only have 15 minutes.
And I'd like to speak with Mr. Johansson, actually.
Okay.
Thank you. All right.
All right, then, yeah, I just have a quick thing, and David Carey has a couple of quick updates. My quick thing, really just as a piece of good news, is that, as you know, we make contributions to the police and fire pension every year, and we projected this year a 7.45% rate of return, and the rate of return actually came in at 11.1%.
Oh.
So we gained a little bit of ground. It's good news. That all then gets smoothed into the,
Yes.
into the long year thing, so.
It's the
but
obligation in the
anyways,
future.
it was good news, and I wanted to make sure that you knew that. And then I think David had a couple of quick
Yeah,
updates.
David had some things.
That is good news.
It is. Way to manage, John.
That's great return.
Yes, thank you for just a couple minutes here. I just wanted to give you an update on a couple projects that we're responsible for, or I should say part of the responsibility for. One is the comprehensive plan update to the 2050 plan. That's an ongoing major effort by our office. We are in a stage now where we're talking about future growth scenarios, as well as starting to get into more of the detailed discussion about transportation. And so this week we'll be doing a lot of focus groups on the transportation side of things. Just want you to be aware of that if you hear about it. Perhaps some of you are already involved in that. The other is that I am certainly available, as is my staff, to talk to you about anything you might have an interest in for the comprehensive plan update. I know that we've kind of, during the pandemic, we've kind of gone virtual, so it's not as out in the public, but we are certainly still working on it. There's a lot of material to talk to. At some point, we'll give you a full-fledged briefing on that, but I want to make sure you're aware that we're available to you at any time for that purpose. We also, going into October, will be focusing on the county side of things a little bit more, so we have some public meetings getting planned for that, so just so that you're aware of that. The second item I want to make sure you're aware of is that we have just received the updated draft of the 33rd and Cornhusker sub-area plan, which is related to the RTSD work for the 33rd and Cornhusker major roadway improvement, obviously. That plan is in good shape. We don't know yet what the council schedule is for you to receive that, but it will be before the end of the year, calendar year. And I will just note that this plan is reflecting the updated alignment, preferred alignment for all those road improvements, plus there has been an awful lot of outreach and effort to get in touch with affected property owners and to convey that new preferred alignment since the last time we had this conversation with the council. So I believe we'll be in a better spot when we come back to you than we were last time. The plan itself has a lot of the same information, but it is reflecting that preferred updated alignment. So just to make sure you're aware of it, and if you have any questions on that, certainly let me know. We can have a conversation about that. Thank you.
Any other questions? Anything else that we would like to talk about for the directors?
Directors, that's it.
We've got a couple directors we want to talk to, so we'll go ahead and stand adjourned.
Really easy.